Hey y'all. Um, so I saw Disclosure Day, the new Steven Spielberg movie, and I thought I would talk about it a bit. Um, there's no such thing as a perfect movie, but I did like it quite a bit. Now, to be fair, there were some parts I liked, some parts I found clunky. Something was like, okay, Spielberg is getting old. But you if you don't know anything about it, it has this you can watch the trailer. There is a there's definitely sort of an over optimistic take at the end where it it really tries to push the let's be more empathetic angle a bit too hard. And I've seen online reviews, a lot of people just absolutely hating on it for that and calling it sort of too boomer and so on, being sort of naive and unrealistic and so on. But some of the things I thought was just brilliant, and I don't think it's sort of widely realized, and so that prompted me to think it might be a good uh, topic to talk about, because there is a very specific part of that, and it's unrelated to whether it's good or bad or whether it's old fashioned or not, which is that a lot of people seem to feel that the movie got quote unquote aliens wrong. Um, not about the plot or the pacing or something, but the actual sort of the nature of it itself, the way that quote unquote disclosure happened, and then sort of the shape of that encounter. And I think that's interesting because Steven Spielberg is not just a random dude making a random UFO movie. Okay. And if you're not sort of old enough to realize this, he's made other movies in this genre before, and in fact a lot of even the cartoon version of what aliens should be comes from his prior movies. You may have seen the memes without realizing what the references were, etc. And so you can't really talk about this movie without, to some extent, knowing about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is almost half a century old, like late 70s or something. There's this normal guy who sees, these strange lights in the sky, and there's government secrecy. There's this special mountain, no spoilers. But yeah, in the end, there's this big final encounter, lots of flashing lights. There's a very childlike vibe to it, and so on. And there's this sense of terror that becomes this awe, and then there's this sort of invitation at the end, and there's this aspect on how this is a normal person, and he goes quote unquote crazy trying to reconstruct this vision that he had, and in the end, it's shown as there's this intent to communicate. There's this special musical tone. Again, go see the movie. Not going to talk too much about it, but that is part of the context in which you should evaluate this movie, sort of, right? And there's the sense of there's a preconceived notion of what alien contact is supposed to feel like, and in that context, people then complain about this doesn't look right, or this is not how it should be, as if there is some notion of how it should be, so that's and I would use this as a segue to a character whom I absolutely knew nothing about, sort of earlier in my life, but I later stumbled across and then read some books by him and so forth, who's Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée was around, he was actually hugely influential to Steven Spielberg, even in the 1977 movie, because he's been around that long. He's had a varied background. He was a sort of a computer science person. He was I think astronomy or something like that. Some of these special programs, and he was one of the original people who sort of did a very scientific view, scientific investigation into the this sort of this what was earlier the UFO phenomenon, but I think is now rightly termed this UAP. And he reached sort of some interesting conclusions, which, and we alluded to some of this in the previous video, which is there's a let's call it a cartoon version of Alien Contact, where there are these spaceships, and these spaceships are flying around by some aliens from somewhere, and sometimes these spaceships crash, and there's this very sort of mechanical notion of how it should be. But he found that none of the cases sort of matched this. There was no real evidence to say this was the case, and in fact, it wasn't as if these are sort of aliens from a different planet who want to meet with the quote "take me to your leader" type vibe. So it was actually very sort of absurd, where it's there are some physical traces, and so there's this undeniable aspect to the phenomena, but also there's sometimes some dream logic. There are sometimes religious overtones, or some sort of trickster-like behavior, the way the events happen, and so on. And so Vallée came to this conclusion, which, to be honest, is what I also now believe, which is this whole extraterrestrial hypothesis is a bit cartoonish, and is very constrained and limited. And it doesn't encapsulate the weirdness of the record. And there is no. This is unsatisfying because it's sort of a negative conclusion. It's not a positive conclusion. It's not saying they're not that, they're this. There's no this to point to. But he did conclude that there is no this simple mechanistic notion of some mechanical spacecraft flying around that we happen to see, but we just denied from getting our hands on it, but they do exist somehow. So it's in his view, it's all somehow very weird. And like I said, I read a few of his books after that. My favorite one has a bit of a weird title called Passport to Magonia, which I wish he had picked a better title to make it more relatable to people. Okay, so he noticed that these the UFO stories that he came across had sort of resemblance to, in some very abstract way, they had some resemblance to older stories, in the sense that the encounter stories with quote-unquote aliens were similar to encounter stories with other sort of, let's call them weird visitors, except those weird visitors in old folklore stories may have been sort of fairies or angels and stuff like that. And he drew this parallel, which is there is this similarity where, there's a different form, of course, but this is the same level of weirdness. Now it might seem as a stretch, so I'll leave it at that. But the point is, and so there's no proof over here. So it's like a conjecture. But it was his way of saying, look, this alien from a different planet is a simplistic answer, and it doesn't really describe it. It doesn't make sense. So nothing else seems to make sense either, but we can at least say that this doesn't make sense. So there is some symbolic aspect to this, and we don't know more, but this is where he landed, which is that there's this weird similarity. Anyway, so why did we go down this rabbit hole? It's because that this was not truly present in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I've heard this. I read some books about that, the making of the movie and so forth, and apparently Vallée was not pleased that this was not part of that movie. But I think this is part of Disclosure Day in some sense, and in fact, it is part of the Disclosure Day in the sense that the aliens don't feel like you think they should feel. um, and um, you know what he's saying is don't make these aliens just these sort of these animals, or whatever species from somewhere else, and these little people type thing, which is what um, Close Encounters did. It had this. It was very neat in this sense. There was this nice costumed little people with this music and these lights, and then this mothership comes, and there's a nice sort of communal experience in the end. These children come out, and the protagonist of our movie decides to walk in, and that's the end. But that that worked too well, and so it created people's expectations for what this cinematic alien should look like, and that became their sort of reality test, which is, oh, the CGI is so bad, these aliens don't look real, which is such an absurd thing. What do you mean that aliens don't look real? What is this real alien anyway? Anyway, so now Steven Spielberg made this movie, and so there are many aspects to it. In fact, the name of the movie itself creates expectations. It's like, especially because there are other sort of documentaries with similar names right now, and they all have to do with disclosure of something to do with aliens, with the visitations or observations or craft and stuff like that. So people expect that to happen, and there is already this built-in expectation for what where you're expecting this thing. And so the strange fact of this movie is that it refuses to do that, but it also gives you something closer to what is possibly more true. Possibly more true in the sense of what I was talking about earlier, in terms of what the sort of conclusions that Vallée landed on. And so the movie does have a bit of those tried and tested tropes on government secrecy and stuff like that. And it's not just government secrecy now. There's this fictitious company that's doing that's the private contractors are the bad guys keeping this stuff, and so on. But we don't have that neat sort of ending that Close Encounters of the Third Kind had, where there's this music and there's people looking up, and there's some stuff that has happened, and something is that you knew this thing was hidden and now it is not hidden, and so on. That doesn't happen in Disclosure Day, and it is, but at the same time it is somehow also more invasive. Like the character, I forget her name, the one played by Emily Blunt, was it Margaret? I forget, but she suddenly has the ability to know things and sense things and stuff like that, which is a bit more weird. It's not sort of seeing and hearing something. It's a bit of a becoming something aspect. And so there is no alien arriving in a ship type thing. There are some cut scenes of this in the end, in the found footage aspect of this, which is which I found a bit questionable, but whatever. It's capped to like a few minutes in the end of the movie. But apart from that, there is no grandiose appearance or anything like that. And there is this big difference where the non-human presence doesn't just come as these little people in little alien costumes, but in this animal form, which I think was a brilliant move. But again, totally not in line with expectations, and therefore it sounds ridiculous. You know, you can go on Reddit, you can, or wherever else, and you can see these, oh, the alien are these weird CGI animals. It's, you can sort of make fun of it. Are we sure about the raccoon? But and it's but conceptually, this is sort of an ironic fact maybe, but conceptually that is actually the most interesting part of the movie. And in fact, it didn't go deep enough there, because that is the hook to this alternative interpretation of what the UAP and other such phenomena actually could be. Because it's not about like this elegant alien design and this sleek spaceships and stuff like that. If you keep this Vallée's thoughts and concepts in your mind and look at it from that lens, then this is exactly what you would expect. The sort of the high strangeness sort of nature of UAP points at exactly stuff like this, where there is no nice mechanical alien spaceship coming in, but rather some sort of symbolic experience that you have somehow. So if you're a child and you expect to see deer and birds, then you see deer and birds, something like that. Okay. And so, you may see spaceships, you may see, go back in time, you see airships, go back in time, you see angels and demons, go back in time, you see fairies, stuff like that. Somehow there is this angle to it. Now, obviously, it's not like they're all the same thing, but that is, and it's not necessarily true or false, but my point is, Disclosure Day captures whatever the essence of UAP is better than this sort of cartoon nuts and bolts view that people have. And if Close Encounters of the Third Kind was not in accordance with Jacques Vallée at that time, 50 years ago, it is a bit closer, or it has a bit more convergence with that today. And ironically, it is less satisfying to most people because of that, because it doesn't have the cool CGI, or there's some sort of like you put on your 3D glasses and there's some alien ship going through. This is none of that. So anyway, and maybe it could have been shorter. Maybe it could have avoided some of the explanation. Maybe Spielberg was trying to do too many things and leave some references, things like that too. But yeah, you can't fault it for, or you shouldn't at least fault it for not being authentic. You can complain about the other things. Yes, I also agree that there are some things like the way the TV station plays a certain role and stuff, which feels like a little bit older in time, but that's okay. I mean, you can just think about it, place this movie in like 2012 or something and move on with life. Okay, judge it according to that. Let's see. That's yeah. I mean, I was. We can go deeper into maybe some aspects of Vallée and so forth, but I'm gonna leave it at this right now. We might talk about some of this later. All right.